Welcome to the Quincy Institute's book talk on Mohsen Milani's new book, Iran's Rise and Rivalry with the United States in the Middle East. My name is Trita Parsi. I'm the Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute, a transpartisan think tank in Washington that promotes ideas that move U.S. foreign policy away from endless war and toward rigorous diplomacy. We favor a national security strategy that is centered on diplomacy and military restraint. In his new book, Iran's Rise and Rivalry with the United States in the Middle East, renowned scholar Mohsen Milani dissects the strategic logic behind Iran's regional policy and tells the story of how a revolutionary state, boxed in by sanctions and war, emerged as one of the most influential forces in the region. Milani unpacks how Washington's post-1979 containment strategy in many ways backfired, tells the story of the evolution of the U.S. Iran rivalry, and explains how the so-called axis of resistance was born and whether Iran can sustain this path given its many internal and increasingly external challenges. Of course, some of the most impactful events and developments have occurred in just the last couple of months since Milani finished his book, which is why we're so privileged to have him with us today to hear his analysis of how the story has evolved, not just since the 1979 revolution or before, but also in the last couple of months and weeks. For those of you who are joining us via Zoom, please use the Q&A function to ask your questions. I will try to get to those throughout our conversations. If you are watching on Facebook, on Twitter, etc., you can use the comment section and we will try to get to those questions as well. So with no further ado, let me do a proper introduction of Professor Mohsen Milani. He's a professor of politics at the University of South Florida, where he is the executive director of the Center for Strategic and Diplomatic Studies. He has authored over 80 publications on Iranian politics and foreign policy. He has served as a research fellow at Harvard, at Oxford, at the University of Venice, and he has testified before the U.S. Congress on Iranian affairs. Mohsen, thank you so much for being with us. It's with a privilege and a great honor to read your book, and really delighted to have you here with us to delve into it much, much more deeper. Thank you for being here with us. So let me ask the first question. I'm going to give you a broad question. Why did you write this book? There's no shortage of books, of course, on Iran and the US. Why did you choose to write this book, and what is the main thesis that you are presenting in this book?
Thank you very much for your introduction, Dr. Parsi, and thank you to the Quincy Institute for the wonderful job they're doing promoting peace and diplomacy in a very troubled region of the world. Like any author, I decided to write this book because I wanted to solve a puzzle that I had been struggling with for a long time. Around 2013 or 14, I realized that after almost 4 decades of U.S. sanctions, international sanctions, U.S. policy of containment, Iran has become a major power in the Middle East. Now, whether it's good or bad, I leave it up to the audience to judge. But for me, as a scholar, the question was, how was it possible for a country that was contained for over 4 decades, that had suffered through sanctions and all kinds of other problems, how was it possible for Iran to become such a formidable power, so much so that some people exaggerated by saying that Iran had become a major regional power, if not a superpower in the Middle East? And that's when I decided to write the book. I started writing the book after almost a decade of research, around the time that COVID hit all of us. And at that time, I was unable to go to school, to the university, for my administrative and teaching responsibilities. And thanks to that virus, I was able to stay home and finish that book. And I finished it right before, and that's a very critical element to mention. I finished the book before the fall of Assad regime and before the killing of Nasrallah in Lebanon.
And the main thesis that you're mentioning, that the reason why you wanted to explain how a country with that type of isolation and challenges nevertheless managed to somewhat paradoxically emerge as such a powerful country. And if you could just give us a summary of what the thesis of the book is in terms of how that was possible for them.
When I wrote my first book on the causes of the Iranian Revolution, I learned something very valuable that has been the guiding principle of my scholarship, and that is to explain social phenomena, to explain complicated issues. You just can't pinpoint on one factor and say this has caused this or that. That is something they can do in hardcore sciences, in physics and chemistry, but in social sciences and in international relations, you can't do that. So what I tried to do in that book, I looked at about 3 or 4 major themes or major causes that I thought had helped Iran become a major power. The first, and perhaps the most important one, is that I discuss in the book how the Islamic Revolution justified justified the power expansion of Iran in the region, and provided, here comes the key, provided the will, the political will, and the manpower to expand its power. If you look at the history of revolutions from the French Revolution of 1791 to the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, you'll see that revolutions have that tendency. They think they are very righteous, they think they can spread their message, and the Iranian Revolution did something that perhaps other revolutions did not. It combined revolutionary zeal with religious zeal. And the area was sort of receptive to the Iranian message. And therefore, I look at that revolution. And then the second factor that is combined with this is the importance of Iranian involvement in different wars, starting with the Iran-Iraq war. In other words, I argue in that book that the combination of the Islamic Revolution plus Iranian involvement in the war provided the ideological and military basis for Iran to expand its power in different countries. And throughout the book, I bring specific example by looking at how Iran expanded its power in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Yemen, and in Gaza with its relationship with major Palestinian groups.
One of the things that is so fascinating with the book is that you don't just look at the era after 1979. You're also looking at what happened during the time of the Shah. And I think you point to various continuities that also have existed. If you could explain what those continuities are and say perhaps something of how that lends itself to the largest thesis that you're presenting, which is at the end of the day, despite its ideology, by and large, you have some exceptions, but by and large, this is a regime that is pursuing its perception of its interests in a very Machiavellian way, rather than some sort of ideological, irrational thing that puts that doesn't have a cost-benefit analysis in the manner that it pursues foreign policy. But in that, what are the continuities, and what does that say about the conduct of the Islamic Republic?
Like any scholarly work, you must base your approach to international politics based on a conceptual framework or your understanding how the world operates. I summarize this in my book by talking about PSI as the essence and foundation of foreign policy. P standing for power, S for security, and I for interest. And I argue that what drives different countries to pursue these 3 goals, most importantly power, is not the structural configuration they have, but rather their interests and the sense of their security. Once you begin to look at Iranian behavior, say in the past 50 years, past 70 years, both during Mohammad Reza Shah's rule as well as during Khomeini rule, you see that that's exactly what has driven Iran to pursue different policies. Let me give you some very specific examples. We keep talking about how Iran has used non-state actors to undermine its rivals and to expand its power. Is that something new? Absolutely, it's not. Let me give you one very concrete example. In the 1975, when Iran had become the major military power in the Persian Gulf, the main obstacle to Shah's expansion of power was Saddam Hussein in Iraq. So what Iran did, starting with the early 1970s, with the help of Israel and the United States, they formed an axis, Tel Aviv, Tehran, Washington, or Mossad, CIA, Savak axis, providing financial support to the Kurds, to Barzani. And in your excellent book, you discuss those issues. But Iran used the Kurds as a proxy. Now, in 1975, the Shah reached the conclusion that Iran is getting too involved in the Iraqi affairs, and therefore he should end its support to Barzani and the Kurds. And guess who didn't like it? The Israelis didn't like it, the Americans didn't like it, but I think the Shah made a very wise decision based on the national interest of Iran and got out. Even in Lebanon, where Iran has deep historical roots, you know, when Shiism was established in 1501 in Iran, Iran was predominantly a Sunni country. And therefore, they went to southern Lebanon, where Hezbollah is very strong, and to southern Iraq to bring clerics to Iran. So in the 1960s, when Iran felt threatened by Abdel Nasser and his pan-Arabism, what did the Shah do? The Shah went to Lebanon, turned Lebanon into the headquarters of Savak and Iran's entire operation in order to undermine Abdel Nasser and pan-Arabism. You see the same thing taking place after. In other words, the Shah tried to become the dominant power in the Persian Gulf with the help of the United States, and he made it. The Islamic Republic is trying to do the same thing, not with the help, but in opposition to the United States, hence this continuity that I'm talking about.
Very interesting. And in that, do you trace some of the origins of Iran's forward strategy? And I want you to explain what that is, the forward defense strategy, to the era of the Shah as well? Or is it something that is entirely born afterwards? And under what circumstances and why was it born? Was it something that was completely designed by Iran, or was it a reaction to circumstances?
I think if you look at the evolution of Iranian regional policy, this idea of forward defense became really the cornerstone when Qasem Soleimani became the head of the Quds Force around 2000. Prior to that, yes, Iran had started helping proxies. And by the way, this idea of Iran helping non-state actors didn't start with Hezbollah. It started during Iran-Iraq war. And then in 1982, once Israel invaded Lebanon, that's when Iran decided to help Hezbollah. But the important issue is that it started around 2000. And the essence of that argument is not very difficult to understand. The Islamic Republic, or the strategists in the Islamic Republic, believe that there is asymmetry of power between the United States and Iran. There is no way Iran could confront the United States through conventional warfare. And therefore, they decided one way we can do it is to resort to asymmetrical strategies, that is helping non-state actors. And secondly, is to pursue this forward defense. In other words, Ayatollah Khamenei famously once said, I prefer to fight our enemies in the streets of Syria and Lebanon than in the streets of Tehran. Well, to be honest with you, we see something taking place in Iran that in a way shows that there was some justification for his thinking. I'm not saying that they did the right thing. We can talk about the mistakes Iran made later on. But in terms of the idea that if we go there and if we have forces that can retaliate against the United States, we can develop a sort of asymmetrical deterrence. That policy, of course, did not work. And today we see that it has been almost shattered.
So let's get into that deeper, though, where that policy is now, because as you said, things have changed quite fast since the publication of the book. You write in the book, for instance, that as the Islamic Republic commemorates its 45th anniversary, it wields more power in the Middle East than at any point in Iran's recent history, all while protecting Iran's political independence and territorial integrity. This accomplishment is no small feat. Today, of course, I think the impression clearly is that the situation is very different. I would like to get your read on that, whether it is or not. But there's so many questions that emerges from that. Was it a success? Was it a complete failure, or was it a success to a point? An argument can be made, for instance, that had there not been for a Hezbollah, that Israel could not pass in 2006. Already in 2006, Israel might have attacked Iran. Do you think that is an accurate argument? Is there any evidence for that? But also, why did it fail? And why did it fail so fast and spectacular? What were the mistakes that were done in the Iranians from the Iranian side?
Let me begin by taking some credit for myself. As I said at the beginning, I wrote this book. I wrote the conclusion of the book before the fall of Assad and before Nasrallah was killed by Israel. What you read is the first part of the conclusion, and I stand by it. By the time that I had written this, I think Iran was able to exercise its power in a way that it hasn't done so for centuries. There is no question about this. They were reaching almost to the Mediterranean. They had naval presence, small naval presence, but nevertheless naval presence. They were a formidable force in Lebanon. You can't deny that. They were the formidable force based on American observations in Iraq. They were helping Hamas, and they were helping the Houthis. However, in the second part of that conclusion, I asked the key question, the second key question of the book. The first question was, how did Iran make it? But the second and more relevant question was, can Iran sustain it? And my answer, and that's why I said I want to take some credit for it, my answer was a decisive no. I said, this is unsustainable. And I came out with 3 or 4 major reasons. And I'm quickly going to go over this if you want. We can discuss it. My first point was that Iran has over-reliance on non-state actors. And in a world dominated by states and multinational corporations, this is not sustainable. I even made the argument that Iran is being unfair by helping these non-state actors. And I asked the question in the book, would Iran be happy and pleased if other countries do that to Iran and start supporting militias inside Iran? And my answer was no. So I said, this is unsustainable. The second factor I discussed is that Iran's relationship with all these 5 countries and entities from Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, Houthis, etc., is based on security and military issues. Iran was spending a lot of money, a tune of about $400 to $800 million a year for Lebanese Hezbollah. And as you know, Iran spent at least $10 to $20 billion in Syria. And I asked the question, what is Iran getting in return? And my answer was not much. And I argued that a relationship that is based on security and military bases is unsustainable. Thirdly, perhaps the most important argument I made in that book is that Iran started the Cold War with the United States during the hostage crisis, Tehran hostage crisis. And that was a huge mistake that Iran made, and we are still paying the price for that mistake. And at the end, I argue that Iran does not have the capability, the resources to win this war against the U.S. and Israel. Essentially, I said Iran's ambitions exceed its military and economic power. Finally, I made this point, which is the concluding paragraph of the book. I said the Shah of Iran became the most powerful man in the Middle East in 1979. Rich with oil wealth, largest military, 550,000 strong, perhaps best after Israel, best air force in the region. And yet he was overthrown domestically. Why? I argued because he did not have the kind of legitimacy that he should have had. And I argued in the book, the Islamic Republic is facing the same thing. And I said, its deterrent policy is not going to work because Iran has now created new enemies. And I said, as long as there is no popular support for what the Islamic Republic is doing, that rise or that power expansion is unsustainable. And therefore, I'm not surprised about what has happened. And let me make one final question, one final issue about when I think Iranian decline began. Iranian decline in the region began after the assassination of Qasem Soleimani. That's when the decline began. That is when Iran realized that it's without him, it cannot pursue the same policy. Now, if you look at the evolution of the Iranian regional policy from 2000, around 1990, when Soleimani became the Quds Force leader, all the way to the time he was killed, in many ways, Iran was actively pursuing policies, not in reaction to other countries' policy, but in order to pursue its own interests. In other words, Qasem Soleimani was pursuing both offensive and defensive policies. Once he died, if you look at what Iran has been doing in the past 4 years, Iran became a passive player, getting hit and not responding. And that's after the October 7th tragic attack on Israel by Hamas terrorists. I think the decline accelerated, and Iran has been only reacting. And as long as they do this, the decline is going to continue.
Several follow-up questions. One very quick one. If you put the inflection point at the killing of Soleimani, would you put it as a result of Soleimani's persona and his capabilities and his control over the Quds forces and the Quds forces disciplined control, may be too strong of a word, but guidance of many of these different groups in the Axis? Or is it because once the US was showing a willingness to use force, it dramatically changed Iran's calculations, because there seems to have been a perception that ultimately the US would not be willing to go that far. And Trump changed the equation of that, and he changed it again just a couple of weeks ago. Or is there a third explanation that you would point to?
I think the key issue about Qasem Soleimani, in addition to him being a very different kind of general than others, he was unique in a way, and I discussed that in the book. He was unique in a way that he would go to the battlefield. He knew everybody personally. And most importantly, he could bypass the bureaucratic red tape, because Ayatollah Khamenei trusted him. He didn't have to go and get approval from the Iranian parliament. He didn't have to go to Iranian national security. On spot, he could make decisions. I quote Maliki, former prime minister of Iraq, saying that when ISIS was threatening Baghdad, they approach Americans and they ask for weapons. And the Americans said, well, it's going to take a while. He said, I picked up the phone, called Qasem Soleimani, and Qasem said, don't worry about it. 24 hours, bang. The weapons were there. That's one factor. But more important than that, much more important than that, you know, in Iran, personalities play much more important role than institutions. We've always had that. If you look at history of Iran, why do you think Nader Shah was a conqueror and others were not? It's the same country, same people. It had to do with his charisma. You know, Qasem Soleimani was a charismatic character. For this book, I interviewed a four-star American general, and was very kind to me, provided all kinds of information. And one of the interesting things he told me was that he would hear from the Iraqi partners that when Qasem Soleimani would enter a room, people noticed something different. He was a charismatic guy, and he had established personal relationship with everybody. And moreover, he wasn't afraid to make decisions. That's why at the beginning of my talk, I said Iran's ability to expand power had to do with the will of its leader at the beginning. Qasem Soleimani had that will. And after he disappeared, nobody has been able to demonstrate or exhibit that kind of will.
Very interesting. I want to go to one of the questions in the chat, but before I do that, you make it very clear that it is the sustainability of that policy that simply was not possible. And you list several different factors. A different way of looking at it, though, is to say, let's set aside whether it is sustainable or not. What other options did Iran have, and would they have worked better at the time? So, for instance, you point out the amount Iran spent in Syria, for instance. And ultimately, of course, it lost Syria. But it did arguably create a situation in which the presence of Syria under the influence of Iran prevented a larger attack by Israel against Iran 10 years ago. In the absence of Syria, we see very clearly that the geopolitical landscape changes dramatically in the manner in which Iran could retaliate and many other things. What other options could Iran have pursued at the time? And this is not to defend it or criticize, just to see objectively what could any of those have been more sustainable and successful?
Well, both you and I can go on discussing this for hours because we talk about hypothetical things that didn't happen. So I'm not going to discuss what would have happened if Iran would not have done this or that. However, that's what I can say. The fundamental cause of Iran's conflict with the U.S. in the Middle East has nothing to do with ideology, has nothing to do with human rights violation, had nothing to do with the Islamic essence of the Islamic Republic. It has everything to do with power. Iran is seeking to expand its power, and the U.S. is trying to maintain its hegemonic role in the Middle East. That's what international politics is all about. That's why I started by telling you PSI, power, security, and interest. Now, in that context, I think during Iran-Iraq war, in 1975, 1985, the so-called Iran-Contra affairs. And right after that, and a number of occasions, Iran could have tried to normalize relations with the United States. Developing normalized relations is very different than having friendly relations. But they could have normalized relations with the United States. That was the major conflict between Rafsanjani and Khamenei. Khamenei won that power struggle and sidelined Rafsanjani. But today, we see that Iran is paying the price for that victory, that Iran should have normalized relations with the United States. They should have tried to reach some sort of agreement with the United States in the region. They could have done it. They did not want to pay the political price. That's one part of the equation. The other part is that Iranian ideological animosity toward Israel, which has undermined Iranian national interests for the past 45 years. I just don't get it. I just don't understand why they do that. You could oppose Israel, no problem, but calling for the destruction of another state, and Iran has done that, no question about it. Iran has, when I say Iran, Iranian leaders have called for destruction of the state of Israel. What is got to do with Iranian national interests?
I want to get much deeper into that in a second.
But let me just finish this.
Sorry.
Yeah. So the point I was trying to make, that even in terms of the Cold War, not only Iran did not normalize relations with the US, they doubled down by trying to undermine Israel, America's major ally in the Middle East. When you do that, you get what you get. There is a famous saying that if you think the way you've always thought, you're going to get what you've always got. They have to change that policy.
And I think right now we can see that rather clearly in the refusal to engage directly with the Trump administration. There's been engagement, but not the type of direct engagement, which I think also further complicates the ability to fully explore what flexibilities may exist on the American side. But one part of the equation at the same time, though, is, of course, there was a JCPOA. There was an effort. Iran did sign it. It did live up to it. It was the United States that pulled out of it. So, but I want to get to a question from a very legendary figure that we have in the audience, John Limbert, one of America's most prominent diplomats, unfortunately had to spend 444 days as a hostage in Iran. And as a trained historian, also ask a question that goes perhaps a bit deeper than what we have talked about here, because he says, thanks for the great discussion and great book. Aren't the roots of Iran's strategy much deeper than the Pahlavis and the Islamic Republic, given the country's very long history of foreign invasions that destroy dynasties by penetrating the barriers to the Iranian heartland and plateau? You didn't address it in the book, but here's an opportunity. Do you see even further continuity than just between the Islamic Republic and the Pahlavi regime?
Well, first of all, let me say salam to John, and he is a great friend, and he was kind enough to endorse my book, and I've always enjoyed having conversation with him, and he is among the best experts on Iran. Yes, I think I am in the process of writing a piece about the key issue of Iran's role in the region. And in that piece, I'm arguing that for at least past 200 years, 220, 230 years, from the time that at least a quarter of Iran territory was ceded to Russia until today, Iran has tried to play a major role in the region. But unfortunately, because of collusion between different powers, because of the mistakes Iran had made, Iran has failed to do that. And this idea of power expansion by Iran after the revolution is part of that same mentality, that Iran has to play the role that it deserves to play. Now, again, here you see the continuity between the Shah, who wanted to create a new civilization, make Iran the new Japan of the Middle East, and the Islamic Republic, which wants to make Iran the dominant Islamic power in the Middle East. So you see the same continuity in terms of Iranian desire for two things that are connected together. You cannot separate those two. One is the question of sovereignty, as John has correctly mentioned, because Iran has been manipulated. There is no question about it. Has been exploited and manipulated by external powers. I don't blame external powers. I blame the Iranians who allowed Iran to be exploited by them. That's one. And secondly, the pursuit of power in the region. And I think regardless of what happens to Iran, the future government in Iran, more or less, is going to pursue the same kind of policy. And that is the importance of that book. Look at continuity and, of course, changes in Iranian regional policy.
Very interesting. We also have another very seasoned analyst in the audience, Ken Katzman, who for many, many years was at CRS in Congress. And he asked, I'm sure you know my view is that Iran now has few options other than accepting Mr. Trump's conditions and demands. Tell me why I'm wrong. And perhaps you don't disagree with Ken, but what do you think in this current situation? The forward defense strategy at this point, clearly not what it was before. Iran has been attacked. We don't know exactly where it stands in terms of its missile strength and where its nuclear program is. But does it have any other option in your assessment than to accept what it has resisted for more than 25 years, which is zero enrichment, no nuclear program or enrichment on Iranian soil? Or does it have other options? And regardless of what options you see, where do you think Iran will go?
Well, I have read many pieces by our friend, and I'm quite familiar with the thinking, especially when he was doing the congressional report. It was fantastic, and he has been a guest, to our university, and I respect his views. I really cannot give you an answer to this. I really cannot. And the reason why I cannot is because I don't have enough information about what happened after Israel attacked Iran, why they attacked Iran, and or about the extent of the damage to Iranian nuclear facilities, especially about the enriched uranium. I don't know the extent, how much of it is in possession of Iran. Does Iran have secret facilities, as some people have claimed? I don't know about these issues. And when you don't have that kind of information, I think it's very difficult to say what Iran has to do or what Iran doesn't have to do. But here is what I can tell you, is that this regime, that is, I'm sorry, I use the word regime, I do it in a derogatory way, but this Islamic Republic, if they give up the right to enrichment in a very clear way, they're going to have huge problem of legitimacy inside Iran. Not because they are right or wrong, because they invested too long on this. So they have to make a decision. And the decision is going to be a very tough one. I think Iran still does have some leverage that they can play with and get some sort of agreement that is based on perhaps a little bit of win for Iran and more win for the US. They have the option, of course, of those 400 kilos of enriched uranium. They still have some degree of power in the Middle East. They can try to consolidate what they have there. There are other options. But for me, if I were the Islamic Republic, and they would have asked me, and they haven't, directly or indirectly, so that I want to make this very clear. But if they would have asked me, what do you think we should do? I would tell them, you're making a big mistake by just talking about enrichment. You have to bring the context of normalization with the United States. That would be your winning card. That would be your winning card. Enrichment, without normalization, we're going to get the same thing we got. If you think the way you've always got, you're going to get what you've always gotten. We're going to have another agreement. And once the balance of power changes, perhaps Iran is not going to follow it, and the US definitely is not going to abide by it. Therefore, the best way is to move toward normalization of relationship. That, I think, is something that would allow President Trump to get credit for not only destroying Iranian nuclear facilities, but also doing something that no American president has done since 1979. And it is in that context that then we can address different issues, including Iranian engagement in the region and other things. But I want to be very clear, Trita John, I want to be very clear. Iran cannot win the war, the Cold War against the US. The sooner they realize that, the better off they are. A year and a half ago, I was in a program that was aired in Iran, not inside Iran, but with another person who opposed any kind of relationship with the US. You can Google it, you can see it. I said, look, we don't negotiate with the US now. If we negotiate with the US a year and a half from now, we're going to get less. And I say the same thing today. This idea of we are going to negotiate with the US through mediation of other countries, absolute childish. Direct with the US, deal with the US directly, expand what you want to discuss, and move on. Otherwise, bad days are ahead for you.
Yeah. Would you advocate normalization with enrichment or normalization while giving up enrichment?
I think that is something for the negotiators to discuss. I'm using the term normalization as a leverage. You draw your own conclusion. once the two countries begin to talk about normalization, a lot of these issues are going to be addressed. And I know there are people in Iran who don't want to do that. They could end up doubling down. They could take the route of developing a bomb. I have been reading with great deal of concern and of interest what is taking place inside Iran. And Trita, you have said it many times, because I listen to your programs as well, that I see a change. I see a new mindset in Iran. And this new mindset is that we made a big mistake for not making the bomb. That's the mindset. A lot of people are willing to admit it. A lot of people know it, but they don't admit it. That's my read. That's my read. I also see another thing, another powerful thing taking place in Iran, which is very promising. And that is a sense of patriotism that I haven't seen in Iran since the beginning of the Islamic Revolution in 1979. I haven't seen anything like it. And by the way, in that piece that you also read and made some great suggestions before I published it, I did argue, that is 2 weeks before Israel attacked. I said, if you attack Iran, you're going to see a rise of nationalism that you haven't seen before. And that's exactly what has happened. And that's why I think Iran still does have some leverages that they can play with. And the more they wait, the less weight these leverages are going to have.
Mohsen, I want to shift a little bit to the Israel component of it and stress test a couple of things that you wrote. And incidentally, you have attracted every important Iran analyst in the world, or at least in DC and America, because Barbara Slavin also asked a question very much related to what I was planning to ask. I'm going to give you a quote that you use from Slemani in the book, in which he says, as you know, some people say that we support Palestine because of our interest, but this has not been true since the onset of the Islamic Republic, and it still is not, because we are not ready to negotiate or come to an agreement with the United States and others about the question of Palestine. And you comment on it and you say he unambiguously stated that Iran's policy towards Palestine does not necessarily align with or advance its national interest. The Islamic Republic's ideological commitment to the Palestinian state often adversely impacting its national interest in your assessment. And I think that is a very valid read of what he said. But let me stress test that a little bit, because the pattern I see is that the Iranians are using the Palestinian issue, and they have since the 1980s, for their own interest, and have been, and you write it yourself, that in several different places, you say that Iran has pursued a counterbalancing strategy wrapped in an Islamic guise. And what I see is a pursuit in a rivalry between Iran and Israel that is mostly the function of geopolitics rather than either side actually starting it, in which the Iranians have tried to claim leadership in the region, not in the manner in which the Shah did by saying we're the most advanced country, the Japan of West Asia, or internally by justifying it through Iranian nationalism or secular nationalism, but rather in the guise of Islamic language, as you yourself write. And in that context, a rivalry with Israel, in which they're trying to portray themselves as doing it for the sake of the Palestinians. But in reality, when you scratch the surface, you see that they're much more interest-based reasons for it. It is not that different from the United States. The United States oftentimes justifies its actions by saying it's motivated by upholding the rules-based order, or that we're invading countries because we're trying to defend freedom, whereas in reality, it's quite clear that there are other factors that are involved here. And so the question I have for you is that you are very clear that the rivalry between the United States and Iran is about power. But in the case of Israel, you don't think that that seems to be the case any longer. It's driven by an ideology not about, you don't seem to give any credence that there's other factors involved in that. And I want to give you a chance to respond to my stress test of your argument here, and I want to add some other things to it as well.
I think you're right about the U.S. part. That's exactly what I argued, that this Cold War is founded on power rivalry between Iran as an emerging regional power and the U.S. as the dominant power in the Middle East. And when it came to Israel, I made the same argument. I made the same argument that Iran and I used, by the way, a lot of the good writings you have done. I essentially argued that after 1990, the nature of the relationship between Iran and Israel changed, and I explained how it changed. So there is a power element to it. There is no question. My problem with the policies that Iran pursued toward Israel is that did it actually strengthen Iranian position in the region? And my argument was that no, it did not. And it was more in solidarity with Islamic principle than anything else. If I'm not mistaken, there are about 50 Arab countries, 50 or so Arab countries. Show me one country, one Arab country that has done what Iran has done to support Hezbollah against Israel in Lebanon, to support Assad in Syria, and to support Hamas and Islamic Jihad in opposition to the PLO and Mahmoud Abbas. My argument was that it is perfectly all right to compete with Israel, but when you take that competition to the extreme and you create non-state actors whose job it is to undermine Israel, you should expect Israel to do the same. And what we're seeing today, and I hate to admit this on your program, we see the same kind of ring of fire that Iran had created around Israel. Israel is creating around Iran today. If you oppose Israel, it is your right. It is not your right to call for the destruction of a member of the United Nations. But you want to oppose it? Do it along with 50 other Arab states. Do it along with what PLO had done. Why do you have to support weapons and financial support to these organizations? How does it enhance Iranian support in the region? It does not. If it would have helped Iran, it would have been a different story. It antagonized the Saudis, it antagonized the Egyptians. Nobody was on the side of Iran. And that's why I argued in that book, I argued in that chapter, that Qasem Soleimani was honest enough to come and say, this has nothing to do with our national interests. It has to do with our Islamic responsibility. Accept what people tell you they're doing. That was the essence of Iranian regional policy toward Israel, and I happen to believe that it is wrong, and I hope that Iran quickly and decisively reverses that policy.
Very interesting. So I think those are some very important clarifications, because you're pointing out that the outcome and the counter reaction, of course, has been devastating for the Iranians. And as such, one can certainly make the case that you're making, that this has not been helpful in advancing the interest. I think that's different from saying that the root of this is not the same power competition that also is playing out between the United States and Iran. And I think there's another aspect of it that I think is very important, which is not to treat Israel as a passive actor in that equation. Israel is the state that immediately started pushing the United States to sanction and isolate Iran in 1991, not in 1979, but in 1991. For the first decade was pushing very hard for the United States and Iran to talk to each other, because the geopolitical constellation in the region at the time was very different. It needed Iran, and was more than happy to look aside when Iran was investing in Hezbollah, when Iran was using very venomous rhetoric against Israel. But the geopolitical constellation was different, and it felt that Iraq was more dangerous, and as a result was supporting Iran. Shifted back after 1991, at a time when the Iranians actually had not actively started supporting Hamas or Islamic Jihad at the time when this shift happened. But I think also we see now something else, particularly mindful of what is happening in Syria. With the new government coming out of Al Qaeda and taking over, being embraced by Europe, being hugged by the United States, staying completely silent on Israel, even as Israel is occupying further territory of Israel, of Syria, and nevertheless ending up getting bombed in Damascus itself and calls for regime change. I think we're seeing that there's also a reality in which Israel, in its doctrine, is one in which it wants to dominate the region militarily. David Ivri, a legendary general in Israel, explained it to me himself, saying that Israel does not look at intent, it only looks at capability. And it cannot allow capability to exist in the region that can be of threat to it. And we saw that despite no significant change in Turkey's posture, but Turkey's rise in power after the success in Syria immediately put Turkey now and Erdogan in the target zone of Israel itself. So it seems to me that geopolitical forces have pushed the two countries into a rivalry. It doesn't mean that what the Iranians have done in any way, shape, or form has been helpful, as you, I think, correctly point out. But I want to be careful, and I want to ask you, because a corollary of it, or an extension of this, almost make it sound, if Iran just stopped saying horrible things about Israel, everything would be fine, and the whole thing would
No,
stop. Is that a position you would take, or how would you see it?
absolutely, I do not. No, there is a power rivalry between Israel and Iran. And in that book, I explain how Israel had undermined Iranian national interests on numerous occasions, from assassinating Iranian nuclear scientists, from undermining Iranian nuclear program, from being behind the sanctions imposed on Iran by the United States, from preventing, from trying to undermine JCPOA. I discuss all of that. But my point is that there is a limit to how far you should go in your rivalry. There is a limit, and you should always be mindful whether you actually have the capability to achieve what you want to achieve. Teresa, John, when Israel attacked Iran, US and Israel attacked Iran, I was very clear. I said this is a blatant violation of international law. And even today, as we speak, I believe that one of the most important consequences of the October 7th attack, one of the most important consequences of it is a development of a different mindset in Israel, which is the mindset that you refer to when you talk about that Israeli general. And that is, we are going to not allow any threat emerging in that region, not only in our neighborhood, but beyond our neighborhood. And therefore, I think we have entered into an uncharted territory between Israel and Iran. And I wish we had time to discuss what I think the Israelis are up to and what I think the Iranians are up to. But my point, I want to make this very clear. I wrote this book, and at the very beginning of it, I say, I want the reader to understand the two sides of the story, not just one side, not just your side. I have over 1,000 notes, footnotes in one book, all of it Iranian sources, Israeli sources, American sources. By no means I wanted to imply or suggest that Israel was innocent and Iran made all that mistake. No, they were involved in rivalry. They were involved in trying to dominate the region, and they continue to have that rivalry. My point was that in foreign policy, when you're trying to define your security and your interests, you have to be mindful of your capability and not drain your resources for the fights you cannot win.
And I think you make such a compelling case in the book for that. And I really encourage all of the readers to read it. It's a fantastic read. We do have time for one more question. And I want to go to something that you said earlier on. And I saw several folks in the chat also asked about the human rights situation in Iran. You mentioned that you predicted correctly a significant increase in rallying around the flag patriotism. I personally was surprised by the extent of it, mindful of how unpopular this regime is. Where do you think that puts Iran right now in terms of the options that it has, whether it is to go for diplomacy, whether it is to double down on forward defense, but in some other variation? Are we seeing a situation in which the population that otherwise has tended to be quite critical of much of the Islamic Republic's foreign policy getting in line, or is this just a temporary phenomenon that the government should realize it should not waste? It should try to make sure that it corrects its foreign policy while it has this type of a support from the population.
If you remember a few minutes ago when you asked me about the sustainability of Iranian rise or Iranian power projection, I discussed four factors, and the last factor was the lack of support inside Iran for the Islamic Republic and some of the repressive policies they pursued, particularly toward women and minorities. The important point, Trita John, is this. Originally, the title of my book was Power and Deterrence. Does it work for Iran? And again, my argument was that the deterrent part, the deterrence mechanism Iran established didn't work because of the reasons I said. But the key reason it cannot work in the future is there has to be popular support for it. And right now, the Israeli-American attack on Iran is a God gift to the Islamic Republic. Because for the first time, people of the world should begin to understand why Iran has a 3,000-year history. Because its people understand when they are being threatened by an external force, they unify. That yes, they are upset with the Islamic Republic, and they have every right to be upset with the Islamic Republic. But when your home is attacked, they unify. Now, the Islamic Republic has a unique opportunity to make fundamental changes in its regional policies as well as in its domestic policies. The Iranian people have spoken that they want to defend their country. Now it is time for the Islamic Republic to put an end to Islamist policies, release political prisoners, agree with free elections in Iran, and put an end to some of its repressive policies, because ultimately, all foreign policy is domestic. And if you don't have the support of your people, I don't care how many missiles you have, I don't care how many ballistic missiles you have, I don't even care if you have 2,000 nuclear bombs, as the Soviet Union did. Look what happened to it. Why? Because they did not have the support of their people. And I think the Israelis and Americans inadvertently had given Iran a gift. And I hope they use that gift and make the appropriate reforms inside Iran, and at the same time move toward normalization of relations with the United States, which is not an enemy of Iran.
Excellent point to end this on. Thank you so much, Mohsen, for a fantastic conversation and an absolutely excellent book. I strongly recommend everyone reading it. And before we leave, I wanted to also just plug our next book talk, which I will conduct with Thant Myint Yu on his new book on his grandfather, U Thant, who was the first Western Secretary General of the United Nations. And what he tells in that book is the untold story of the critical role that U Thant and the UN played in several different conflicts, including helping resolve the Cuban Missile Crisis. That conversation will be held on September 30th. For those of you who are not subscribed to our mailing list, please go to quincyinst.org, sign up so that you will get invitations to all of our book talks, as well as other webinars and other publications that we are sending out to you. And I hope to see you on the 30th of September as well. Thank you so much. And thank you again, Mohsen. This was really, really fantastic. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much.